in Champagne, and Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier are the two red grapes. So we've met Pinot Noir before. Light in color, low tannin, good acidity, lots of red fruit character. Pinot Meunier is mostly just grown in the Champagne region. It's a very, very high acid grape. It does have a slightly thicker skin than Pinot Noir. Grows a little bit easier than Pinot Noir, as we know. And then Chardonnay, which is literally grown everywhere on the planet. Cool climate, high acidity. Stone fruit, peaches, apples, as we know. And then more into the hot climate, pineapple, banana, and mango. So here we are again. But let's talk about this in terms of Champagne. So cool climates will have high acidity and low sugar. So Champagne at harvest, high acid, low sugar. I would add that they even harvest and take their grapes off the vines a little bit earlier than they even could to maintain that beautiful high acidity, which was really what gives Champagne its character. So some words that I think I would like you to know would be non-vintage. So non-vintage, you will see it's becoming increasingly common to see multi-vintage instead of non-vintage. It really just means the same thing, that this wine is not from a particular year. It means it's a blend of certain years. Vintage refers to the year. Brut is the level of dryness. There's brut, and then there's something known as extra brut, which means it's even drier. As a general rule, Champagne is dry. Blanc de Blanc refers to a wine made from Chardonnay grapes only. So Chardonnay would be the white, the Blanc from Blanc. We're producing a white wine from white grapes. Blanc de Noir would be from Pinot Noir or Pinot Meunier or both, but we've had minimal skin contact because we're maintaining a white wine from black grapes. So have a look here. Again, I do feel that North America tends to do quite well, at least close by to here with what we're going to be creating. Our sparkling wines from Niagara, definitely not perhaps world class, but they're very tasty nonetheless. So these are the big names in Champagne. So Dom Perignon, Veuve Clicquot, the Ace of Spades, Bollinger, Perrier-Jouët, Cristal, and Krug. As you start to get into more expensive sparkling wines, there is oak treatment which starts to happen. Oak-aged champagnes taste really nothing like a non-vintage style. For someone that enjoys your Perrier-Jouët, your Veuve Clicquot, I would suggest sticking to those styles. For someone that enjoys something a little bit more idiosyncratic or kind of interesting, more of an oak-aged style might be something you might start to want to drink. Bollinger is oak-aged, Salon is oak-aged, Dom Perignon has seen some oak as well. So we've talked about the expensive stuff. You know, the cheapest bottle on this picture here, I believe, is about $73 at the LCBO. The bottle of Dom, depending on the vintage, you're probably looking at about $250. The Cristal, a little bit more than that. And the Krug, probably around that same price too. It's interesting to note that for someone that's a real champagne lover, this is kind of the bottom of the barrel stuff. Once you start moving away from that $200 range and into an $800 and $900 range, you can really start to taste some exciting champagne. So, sparkling wines fermented in tank. So as I mentioned at the top of my lecture, Prosecco, easy to drink, easy to enjoy, cheap and cheerful, and as opposed to being fermented in the bottle, it's done in the tank. Once it's done, it gets bottled after that. So we'll take a step away from sparkling and we'll move in towards sweet wines here. So 5 styles of dessert wine, sparkling wine. Yes, you can have sparkling wine with dessert. I would probably suggest having it at the start of the meal, however, and saving something sweeter for dessert. Sweet wines, richly sweet, sweet red, and then fortified wine styles. When we talk about sweet wines, they should be medium to sweet, and they're generally consumed with the meal, with dessert, or after. Sometimes they'll be served with typically like a foie gras pâté. A sauterne is a classic match for that. That's a very, very tricky pairing. And I would suggest if you are planning to do something like that with a tasting menu, maybe consult with your sommelier at the restaurant that you work at, because that's something that requires a little bit of thinking and a little bit of finesse before you just kind of throw a sweet wine into the middle of a tasting menu. So we're going to talk about sweet and medium sweet. There's 3 ways to make sweet wines. The first is stopping the fermentation. When we stop the fermentation, that means the available sugar that could be used into turning into alcohol is stopped, leaving us with less alcohol than we would have and more sugar than we would have. It can also be added into the blend, or as in the case of some ice wine or sauterne or ripasso styles, they're done by concentrating the sugar in the grape. So these interrupted fermentations would be a vendu naturel. The sweet component could be adding grape juice or sweet wine. And the concentration of sugars can be done with dried grapes, noble rot, or frozen grapes. So we'll talk about these each very shortly. So this is kind of an overview slide. So a sweet wine made by the addition of a sweet component, a Seuss Reserve, or a sweet sherry. Sweet sherries would also be called a cream sherry. And there was a generation of much older ladies that would have a sherry after their supper or towards the evening time. Not a lot of sweet sherry or cream sherry drinkers left out there. And then Seuss Reserve wines would be quite uncommon to find in our market. Sweet wines made from concentrated sugars. This tends to be considered a more quality way of making a sweet wine. So the dried grapes, you could have late harvest, dried on the vines, or a semi-dried grape dried on mats. And that's more common in Italy, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Following that, we'll talk about noble rot, and then of course ice wine, of which here in southern Ontario we are highly regarded for our ice wine production. So Recioto is the grape style. It's the style of sweet wines produced, So upon harvesting, these grapes are ideally left on the vine as long as possible. As we know, the longer a grape stays on the vine, the more likely it is to have a terrible hailstorm or to have them eaten by pests. So you always want to be very conscientious as a vintner about your harvest time. But we're hoping to have grapes with high natural sugar, and then they're dried in mats. And what that does over time, we're turning them, if you're thinking that a dried grape turns into a raisin, it's exactly right. So at least partially raisined grapes are pressed, and from that we're creating a juice, a grape juice that is being fermented that has high natural sugar. The other way is a noble rot from Sauterne. And here you're seeing some grapes that are literally shriveled on the vine. So the noble rot is a spore. It's quite unseemly, and what it does is it attacks the grape, sits on the skin, and pulls out all the water. So proportionately, with less water, it means the proportion of other things, such as sugar, such as flavor, is increased. So what we're doing there is, again, we're increasing the sweetness of our wine. Interesting to note that noble rot can happen not just to grapes, it can attack raspberries as well. And here is a partially noble rotted process. It's known as Botrytis cinerea. And Botrytis would be most likely to attack in damp climates during damp years. It's also what you could say inoculated. So what happens is that a winemaker can actually introduce this into his vineyard to start this phenomenon happening. So during noble rot, the fungus attacks the grapes, forms a powdery film, the water escapes, and then it concentrates the sugars and acid. Water and humidity are the key ingredients for the fungus to survive. So talking more about concentration of sugars, Canada, Austria, and Germany are well known for their ice wine production. Here are some grapes being harvested at Stratus Vineyards. I harvested ice wine grapes once, and I am not keen to repeat that. In order to harvest ice wine grapes, there has to be at least -8 degrees for at least 4 hours, overnight preferred. So incredibly cold temperatures, they much prefer it if you do it at nighttime. So what you're doing is you're pressing, it looks almost like ice. You're pressing this icy, grapey component. So because the water is frozen, only the sugar and acid stay. So because there's so little water, these tend to ferment quite slowly, and they get up to about 10 to 12% alcohol, leaving behind lots of sugar. So because there was so much sugar to begin with, that's how they're able to achieve these quite reasonable still wine alcohol levels. Very common to use Vidal, Riesling, and Gewürztraminer. Vidal is not a grape that we would generally bottle otherwise. The reason that we use Vidal for ice wine, yes, it does have high levels of acidity, but Vidal has a very thick skin, and Vidal is what's known as a hybrid grape, and hybrid grapes were bred to do well in cool climates. So Vidal is an ideal for ice wine, but I would not ever drink it on its own. And that said, if you're being offered ice wine and someone asks you if you want Vidal or Riesling, always take the Riesling, because Vidal ice wine is not of the same quality as some of the other Riesling, Cabernet Franc, or other non-hybrid grape ice wines out there. So it was lovely speaking to you again. I hope to see you soon. So to think about next week. So as you remember, no presentations, but we will talk about fortified wines. And then not this week, but next week, I'll start another quiz running for you. And hopefully we'll be in touch. It's lovely speaking to you, and I hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.